Hey, this is Mrs. Dellosso, and in this video we are going to be talking about the process of photosynthesis. So I stumbled upon this cartoon version of this process, and I thought it was pretty cool because it really does represent the overview of photosynthesis in a unique way. For example, over here we have the sun, right? Sunlight is needed for this process to occur, and this Mr. Sun here is blowing this carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is also needed for this process. We have the plant soaking up water, or H2O, and then producing the glucose and oxygen. So I thought this was great for you guys to have just as an overview of the process. In this video, we are going to be going into much deeper detail of this process. So where does this process occur? It occurs in the plants, in the leaves of plants, excuse me. And it also occurs in these organisms down here called phytoplankton. These phytoplankton dwell in the ocean, and they actually produce a great amount of oxygen that we use. So photosynthesis is great because it produces oxygen and also produces food that we can eat. It also produces the energy that plants can use. So let's not forget that the primary purpose of photosynthesis is to convert this light energy to chemical energy in a storable form. All right, let's talk about the chloroplast. So on the bottom right here, we have a group of plant cells. And if we were to take one of these green structures and zoom in, we'd have what's called the chloroplast. The chloroplast is a membrane-bound organelle unique to plant cells. And let's take a look at some of these structures in here because this is where photosynthesis occurs. So the first structure that we're going to take a look at are these flattened green pancakes called thylakoids. And a stack of these pancakes is called granum. Plural, it will be called grana. And in these thylakoids, this is where the light-dependent reactions will occur of photosynthesis. So that's one part of photosynthesis. The second important structure, or part of the chloroplast, is called the stroma. The stroma is the fluid found in the chloroplast, and this is where the Calvin cycle is going to occur. And the Calvin cycle is the second part of photosynthesis that we'll talk about. All right, next we got to talk about pigments. So pigments are those special light-absorbing molecules. Chlorophyll A is specifically the primary catalyst of photosynthesis. So in this graph here below, this is the light absorption spectrum. And what we'll notice here is we have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and we also have the carotenoids. But I want to focus on chlorophyll A and B here. And what this graph tells us is that chlorophyll A and B are really great at absorbing these purple and blue colors here from light, but they're really poor at absorbing the green light. So they actually reflect it, and that's what gives plants its nice green color. So they absorb these blue and purples, but they reflect the green light, and that's what gives plants its color. And we're going to see in a little while why chlorophyll is important within the chloroplast of the plant. All right, here's the basic formula for photosynthesis. We have carbon dioxide and water and light energy, which are needed for this process to occur. So these are known as the reactants or the inputs. So what gets produced in this process are sugar and oxygen. Therefore, these will be the products. And we have this formula written on this leaf here because that's where it occurs inside the plant, and specifically in the chloroplast. So let's take a look at an overview of photosynthesis. So there are specifically two processes that we're going to look at in detail. So the first, kind of break this up here, photosynthesis, we have light, then we have synthesis. So we're going to look at the light reactions and the synthesis reactions. So the light reactions are going to take place here in the thylakoid, and the light reaction, or also known as the light-dependent reactions, needs the solar or the light energy, and it will also take in the water in order to produce this oxygen. ADP will also be converted to ATP, and another substance called NADPH will also be produced. And together, these things will fuel the second, or the synthesis part of photosynthesis called the Calvin cycle. Now, remember, we had CO2 that was left that needs to be used. So the CO2 or the carbon dioxide will then be used in the Calvin cycle in order to produce these sugars here. Where does the Calvin cycle occur? The Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma of the plant, the fluid. This blue doesn't represent a specific organelle. What this is showing you is that this is a cycle that will continuously occur. So let's take a look at the light-dependent reactions first. All right, so let's take a look at the light-dependent reactions. And I know if you're looking at this, it can look very, very intimidating, but I'm going to walk you through what you need to know. First, I just want to mention that this reaction, the light-dependent reaction, occurs in the thylakoids, specifically the thylakoid membrane. What's the thylakoid? Let's take a look once again. Here is our chloroplast, and within the chloroplast, we have those flattened stacks, which are the thylakoids. So this is where the light-dependent reactions are occurring. So here we go. Now I just want to or remind you what we just looked at in the previous slide. We said that in the light-dependent reaction, we are going to use light and we're going to use water in order to produce the substance NADPH and ATP, and oxygen gas will also be released. So let's take a look how we use light and water in this process in order to produce these substances here. So light energy is absorbed by various pigments and is used to energize electrons in a chlorophyll molecule. So here's our light. It's going to energize electrons, and then these electrons will pass through a series of protein molecules called the electron transport chain. So here's our electrons moving on through here. So as these excited electrons pass through the electron transport chain, some of them will then be used to energize this ATP. So in order to replace the energized electrons that left the chlorophyll molecules, photolysis occurs. And photolysis is the splitting of water into hydrogen ions, electrons, which will pass through the electron transport chain as well, and then the oxygen, which will then be released. So these electrons replace those lost when chlorophyll became energized. The hydrogen ions remain in the thylakoid, and like I just mentioned before, the oxygen is released into the atmosphere, or it can even be used by the cell. So after an electron has passed through the electron transport chain, it is still highly energized. So to capture the remaining energy, the electrons bind in pairs to a special electron carrier molecule known as NADPH. So it'll carry these two electrons here. So when NADP plus, picks up these two electrons and a hydrogen ion, that's when it becomes NADPH. So the NADP plus will pick up these two electrons, and when it picks up this hydrogen ion, that's when it forms this NADPH. So this molecule stores the energy for later use. So in short, the light-dependent phase uses this light energy to form NADPH and ATP. That will then be used in the Calvin cycle, and it also releases this oxygen gas. So that's, in short, a summary of the light-dependent reaction. Now we're going to take this NADPH and ATP and apply it to the Calvin cycle. Okay, so here is a diagram of the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is also known as the light-independent. It was also known as the dark reactions, but it doesn't just occur in the dark. But light is not required for this to occur. But remember, the Calvin cycle is dependent upon that NADPH and the ATP from the light-dependent reaction. It also will then use that last reactant, the carbon dioxide, to fuel this process. So the Calvin cycle is also sometimes called the carbon fixation cycle. Because during this process, carbon is fixed or assimilated into an organic compound, such as those sugars. So let's take a look at this process here. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the cytoplasm of the cell into the stroma. So remember, this occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. And it's going to bind to a chemical called ribulose biphosphate, which we just abbreviate as RUBP. So this RUBP is going to accept this carbon dioxide here. So this resulting compound that forms is actually unstable, and it breaks into something called these PGA molecules. So it has these 3 carbons and a phosphate, and over here we have a 3 carbon and a phosphate. The PGA is then converted to PGAl using the hydrogen and electrons from the NADPH, and the energy comes from the ATP changing into ADP. So now this PGAl is then going to be used to make glucose or to make more of this RUBP. Remember, this is a circle here because we're showing that it's a cycle and it's constantly happening here. So the Calvin cycle produces sugar using the atoms from carbon dioxide, the energy from ATP, and the electrons and hydrogen ions provided by the NADPH. So keep in mind, even though we're going through this whole process like step by step, this is occurring simultaneously inside the chloroplast. And this is how the plants will produce the sugars and also release that oxygen. Let's take a look at another diagram showing the overview of photosynthesis, the light-dependent and the Calvin cycle. So over here we have the light-dependent reaction. We have light and water being taken in and having those electrons go through the electron transport chain in order to produce ATP and NADPH, which will then be used along with carbon dioxide here to produce that PGAl, which will be used to make the sugars here. Okay? And again, from the light-dependent reaction, that oxygen is released. So here's the overview of photosynthesis. I know at first it looked really intimidating with those diagrams, but we just went through the gist of the whole process. But make sure if you have any questions about the process of photosynthesis, bring them with you to class, and we'll go over them when I see you. All right, last thing that we're going to go over are the conditions for photosynthesis. In other words, what it needs in order for this to occur. So the proper wavelengths of light are needed. Without adequate light, the photosynthesis will not be able to occur. Also, amount of carbon dioxide. If there's a lack of carbon dioxide, photosynthesis will not be occurring. And if there's an abundance of carbon dioxide and light, then yes, photosynthesis will continue to do. It may increase, but will eventually plateau and won't go beyond that. Appropriate temperatures or proper temperatures are needed as well. You know, plants can do photosynthesis great at room temperature, but at extreme temperatures it will be very difficult for the plant to do that. And also having an adequate water supply. So good water, a good amount of water will also help the plant in order to do this process. All right, so that sums up photosynthesis. Make sure you bring any questions that you have with you to class for tomorrow. So I hope this was helpful.